Captain Mark Reynolds had never expected to be in this situation. His mission on the alien planet had started like any other. His unit was tasked with scouting enemy positions, gathering information, and preparing for an offensive. Nothing had seemed out of the ordinary. The planet was vast, wild, and dangerous, but they were trained for this. They had handled worse before. The sun beat down harshly on their helmets as Mark and his team trekked through thick alien jungles. The sounds of the unknown wildlife echoed in the distance, but they ignored it. They were soldiers on a mission. That was all that mattered. Suddenly, without warning, the sky lit up. A series of explosions rocked the ground beneath their feet. Mark barely had time to react as the ground split open, sending rocks and dirt flying. The air was filled with the sound of blaster fire from all directions. Enemy troops had ambushed them. A dozen enemy aliens, far stronger and faster than anything Mark had ever seen, emerged from the trees. Their weapons flashed with deadly precision. "Fall back," Mark shouted to his squad, but it was already too late. They were surrounded. The enemy advanced quickly, cutting off any escape route. Mark's heart raced as he looked around. His team was already taking hits. The battle was over before it had even begun. Mark fought to stay on his feet, firing his blaster in short bursts. But every shot seemed to miss. The enemy moved too quickly, and he felt his energy draining with every failed attempt to defend himself. The heat of the moment, the confusion, and the panic made everything feel out of control. "Captain," shouted one of his soldiers, falling to the ground. Another one screamed in pain, but Mark couldn't reach them in time. He could only watch as his team fell one by one, each of them struggling to stay alive. Mark ducked behind a large rock, trying to catch his breath. His mind raced. They had trained for situations like this, but no one had ever prepared him for an enemy so fierce. His rifle was nearly empty. He was running out of options, and soon he would be next. And then, as if fate had stepped in, a strange sound pierced through the chaos. A powerful hum, unlike anything Mark had ever heard before. He looked up to see a massive ship descending from the sky. It was unlike any human technology. Its sleek, silver exterior shimmered under the sun. It hovered effortlessly above the ground, its engines humming with power. Without hesitation, the ship unleashed a flurry of energy blasts that obliterated several of the alien attackers. The ground shook with each explosion, and Mark had to cover his eyes from the blinding light. The enemy forces were thrown into disarray, scrambling to regroup. And then, from the shadows of the ship's entrance, a figure appeared. A tall, imposing alien woman, her armor gleaming in the sunlight, stepped onto the battlefield. Her eyes were fierce, but there was a calmness in her movement that Mark couldn't understand. She was the captain of the ship, Mark realized, as she effortlessly cut down one of the enemy soldiers with a single blow. The enemy scattered, retreating into the jungle as the alien captain continued her assault, her movements smooth and precise. Mark couldn't believe what he was seeing. Here was an alien, a member of the enemy race, saving him and his men. He had no time to wonder why. All he knew was that, without her intervention, he and his soldiers would have been wiped out. The captain turned towards him, her eyes locking onto his for just a moment. Mark couldn't read her expression, but there was something in her gaze, something that told him this was not just a random act of kindness. This was deliberate. She had chosen to save them. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice low and strong. Her words were in perfect English, though her accent was unlike anything Mark had ever heard. Mark didn't know how to respond. "I'm fine. Thanks to you." The alien captain didn't seem interested in his gratitude. Instead, she surveyed the battlefield, her expression unreadable. Her crew had already begun tending to the wounded soldiers, and Mark's team was in good hands. But he could see that this was far from over. The enemy would not give up so easily. "You'll be safe on my ship," she said, turning toward her ship's entrance. "Come with me now." Mark hesitated. He had no reason to trust her. She was the enemy, after all. But there was something about her calm presence that made him want to follow. She had saved his life and the lives of his men. But why? What was she really after? Still, the choice was clear. Stay and fight an unwinnable battle, or follow this mysterious alien captain to safety. The decision was easy. As he made his way toward the ship, Mark glanced back at the smoldering battlefield. His squad was safe for now, but the future was uncertain. He had no idea where this would lead, but he couldn't deny that his destiny had just changed in a way he couldn't comprehend. Captain Mark Reynolds stepped onto the alien ship with a mix of confusion and curiosity. The inside of the ship was like nothing he had ever seen. The walls were smooth and glowing, with strange symbols flashing along the panels. The air smelled clean, almost metallic, and the humming of the ship's engines was a constant, soothing background noise. The alien captain, Verena, walked ahead of him, her tall form moving gracefully through the corridors. Her presence was commanding, and yet there was something calm about her demeanor. She didn't look back to see if Mark was following. It was clear that she expected him to keep up. Mark took a deep breath and glanced around. His men were already being tended to by the alien crew, who moved quickly and efficiently. The human soldiers were all safe for now, but Mark knew they still had a long way to go. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but one thing was clear. He was stuck with the aliens, and somehow, their fates were now connected. "Sit down." Verena's voice cut through his thoughts. She gestured toward a large chair in a small room. Mark hesitated for a moment before sitting down. The captain didn't seem to have time for small talk, but her words held a certain weight, as if she expected Mark to follow her instructions without question. Mark didn't know what to make of her. She had saved his life, but there was still a part of him that couldn't understand why. She was the enemy. They had been fighting her kind for years. It didn't make sense. Yet here she was, helping him and his soldiers. He watched as Verena moved to a nearby control panel and began typing on it with quick, precise movements. She was clearly at home on her ship, confident in every action. Mark could sense her focus, the way she commanded attention without needing to raise her voice. There was strength in her silence, a power that Mark couldn't ignore. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Mark wanted to ask her why she had saved him, but the question seemed too complicated, too dangerous to voice out loud. Instead, he found himself studying her closely. Her armor was unlike anything Mark had seen before. It was sleek and dark, designed for battle, but it was also elegant in a way that made her look more like a queen than a soldier. Finally, Verena turned away from the control panel and faced him. Her eyes, a shade of deep violet, studied Mark with a calm intensity. There was no anger in her gaze, no hatred, just an unreadable expression, as if she had already made up her mind about him. "You wonder why I saved you," she said, her voice steady. Mark was taken aback. "I do," he admitted. "You're the enemy. I don't understand why you would help us." Verena's lips curved into something that might have been a smile, though it was hard to tell. "I don't expect you to understand, but I saved you because I believe that this war, this senseless fighting, needs to end. Too many have already died, both your people and mine." Mark frowned. He had heard this kind of talk before. Peace. It was always a dream, a hope, but never a reality. His people had been fighting the alien forces for years, and every attempt at peace had failed. It was hard to believe that someone like Verena, an alien captain, was interested in ending the war, especially when her people were the ones who had been attacking humanity. "You want peace?" Mark asked, trying to keep the disbelief out of his voice. "You really think that's possible after everything that's happened?" Verena stepped closer, her gaze never leaving his. "It is possible," she said quietly, "but only if we can learn to trust each other. That begins with you, Captain Reynolds." Mark blinked in surprise. "Trust?" He shook his head. "You're asking me to trust you? After everything?" "That's—" "I know it's hard," she interrupted, "but sometimes the hardest thing to do is to take a step forward, even when you don't know where it will lead. Mark looked away. Trust. It was a word he had heard too many times, but it always seemed to fall apart when put into action. He didn't know what to make of Verana's words. Her honesty was unsettling. And yet, something about her made him want to listen. He had no answers, no way to make sense of it all. But he could feel a shift inside himself. The captain had saved his life. Maybe, just maybe, there was something to what she was saying. Verena seemed to sense his hesitation. "You don't have to trust me right away," she said, her voice softening. "But you will have to trust me eventually. I can't fight this war alone. And I don't want to." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Mark could feel the weight of her gaze, but he couldn't quite bring himself to say anything in response. There was too much at stake, too much history between their people. Verena turned away and began to walk toward the door. "I will speak with your commanders. They may not agree with my methods, but we need to start somewhere." Mark stood up slowly, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. As he followed her out of the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. He had been saved by an alien, and now he was being pulled into a partnership he hadn't asked for and didn't fully understand. But there was no turning back now. Captain Mark Reynolds followed Verena through the ship's winding corridors. The glow of the walls seemed to pulse in time with the hum of the engines, and the air was cool, almost sterile. It was strange to be surrounded by so much advanced technology, yet have no idea how it worked. He had been in human military ships for years, but nothing had prepared him for this. The alien vessel was like something from another world, and in many ways it was. The more he walked, the more he noticed how different this ship felt. The design was sleek, efficient, but also oddly beautiful. It wasn't just a war machine. It felt like a living, breathing entity. He couldn't help but be impressed, despite himself. Verena led him to a large conference room. Inside, several of her crew were already gathered, talking in low voices. Mark had seen alien faces before, but these were unlike any he had encountered. They were taller, with sharp features and glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. The crew turned to face him as he entered the room. Their gazes were neutral, but there was something about them that made Mark feel small. "Sit, Captain Reynolds," Verena commanded, gesturing toward an empty chair at the table. Mark hesitated for a moment before sitting down. He wasn't sure what to expect from this meeting, but he knew it was important. Verena was serious about peace, or at least she seemed to be. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the decision that had been made. "Let's get to the point," Verena began, her voice firm but calm. "This war has lasted too long. I don't want to continue fighting. But I need allies, and your people are the most likely to help us." Mark blinked in surprise. He had expected to be treated like an enemy, not an ally. "You want us to help you?" he asked, his voice a little sharper than he intended. "After everything that's happened, after all the deaths, how can you ask that of us?" The room grew quiet. Mark felt the weight of the question hang in the air, as if the answer could change everything. Verena didn't look offended, though. She simply met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," she said softly. "I'm asking for a chance to make things right. My people are not all like the ones you fought. There are those of us who want peace, but we can't do it alone." Mark looked around the room at the other alien crew members. They were watching him, waiting for his response. He could feel the weight of their expectation. He wasn't sure what to say. His military training told him to reject this, to stay loyal to humanity and its cause. But a small part of him, something he hadn't felt in a long time, wondered if there might be another way. Verena sat down across from him, her posture straight and commanding. "You and your people are strong," she said. "I have seen your soldiers fight. I've seen your resilience. That's why I'm asking for your help. I know we can win this war together." Mark opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. Instead, he found himself thinking back to what had happened when she saved him. There had been no hesitation in her actions. She had put herself at risk to save him and his men. And now, here she was, asking for something more, asking for his trust. "I don't know if I can trust you," he finally said, his voice quiet. "I don't know if I can trust any of you. Your people have done terrible things." Verena nodded, as if she had expected this answer. "I understand," she said, "but trust isn't something that comes quickly. It's earned, and I am willing to earn it, if you'll give me the chance." Mark didn't know how to respond to that. He had never been good at trusting, especially when it came to the enemy. But there was something about Verena that made him want to believe her. Maybe it was the way she held herself, the way she spoke. Maybe it was the fact that she had saved him in the first place. He wasn't sure. All he knew was that this wasn't an easy decision. It was the hardest thing he'd ever faced. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. Finally, Mark spoke again, his voice low. "If we're going to work together, we need to be clear on one thing. This war needs to end. We can't keep fighting each other. Too many lives have been lost already." Verena's expression softened. "I agree, but we'll need more than just words. We'll need action. We'll need to convince our leaders that peace is possible." Mark nodded slowly. "I'll do whatever I can to help, but we can't do this alone. We'll need to unite our forces, convince both sides that there's a way out of this." Verena's eyes gleamed with something, hope, perhaps, or determination. "Then we are already making progress." Mark leaned back in his chair, feeling a strange weight lifting from his shoulders. It wasn't a solution, not yet, but it was a start. A small one, but a start nonetheless. For the first time since his mission began, he felt like there might be a way out of the endless cycle of violence. But he knew it wouldn't be easy. It would take time. It would take trust. And it would take sacrifices. "We'll need to get back to the humans," Mark said, his tone more certain now. "We need to tell them what's going on, what we're trying to do." Verena stood up, a determined look in her eyes. "I'll speak to my people. We will find a way to make this work." Mark watched her for a moment, still uncertain but feeling a strange sense of hope. This wasn't the end. This wasn't even the beginning of the end. But it was a start, and that for now was enough. Mark stood on the bridge of Verena's ship, his gaze fixed on the stars outside. The vastness of space stretched out before him, endless and cold. He had spent years of his life fighting, always thinking of the next battle, the next conflict. But now, for the first time, he was looking at the stars with a different mindset. He was thinking of peace, something he had never thought possible between humans and aliens. Verena joined him, her presence calm and steady. As always, "It's a strange thing, isn't it?" she asked, her voice low. Mark glanced at her, not sure what she meant. "What is?" "The idea of peace," she said, looking out at the stars as well. "It feels like an impossible dream, but perhaps we can make it real." Mark wasn't sure if he believed it, but he didn't want to tell her that. She had already risked so much to save his life, and now she was trusting him with the hope of an entire people. He wasn't sure he could carry that burden, but he couldn't back out now. "I hope you're right," Mark said quietly. "I've seen too much destruction to believe peace is possible. But maybe we can make it happen." Verena turned to face him. "We will need more than just the two of us. We will need the support of both our people. The leaders, the soldiers, the civilians, they all must be convinced that peace is the only way forward." Mark nodded. "I know. That's why I need to go back to Earth. We need to talk to the higher-ups, show them what's happening. If we can get them to listen, maybe we can start the process." Verena's expression softened, but there was still a hint of uncertainty in her eyes. And what if they don't listen? What if they still want war? Mark took a deep breath. He had been thinking about that too. "I don't know," he admitted. "But we have to try. We can't just keep fighting forever." There was a long pause as Verena considered his words. Finally, she spoke. I will do everything I can to help you. If it means speaking to my people, convincing them to trust you, I will." Mark was grateful for her support, but the reality of what lay ahead still weighed heavily on him. Going back to Earth was going to be difficult. The leaders of humanity weren't known for their willingness to listen to alien requests. There was too much fear, too much hatred built up over the years. Convincing them that peace was possible was going to take more than words. It was going to take proof. "We can start by showing them that we're not enemies," Mark said, more to himself than to Virana. "If we can work together, if they see that we're willing to make the first step, maybe they'll be willing to follow." Virana nodded, a determined look on her face. "I agree, but it won't be easy." Mark smiled faintly. "When has anything in this war been easy?" She didn't respond, but the quiet understanding between them was enough. They both knew how difficult this would be. It wasn't just about convincing leaders or soldiers. It was about changing the minds of entire populations, breaking down years of fear and distrust. But if they could start somewhere, if they could show that peace was possible, maybe they could make a real difference. Mark took a deep breath and turned to face her fully. "I'll go back to Earth, but I can't do it alone. I'll need your help." Virana didn't hesitate. "I will help you, Captain Reynolds. You are not alone in this." Mark felt a surge of gratitude toward her. She was more than just a warrior. She was a leader, someone who truly believed in what they were doing. And as strange as it was, he realized that he trusted her. He didn't know where this journey would lead, but he knew that, for now, they had to work together. The next few days were spent preparing for the trip back to Earth. Virana's ship was capable of faster-than-light travel, and Mark knew that time was of the essence. The longer they waited, the more likely the situation would escalate again. He had to get back, to speak to the leaders of humanity, before the war could spiral even further out of control. As they neared Earth, Mark couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. On the one hand, he was anxious. He had no idea how the humans would react to the idea of working with the aliens. On the other hand, he felt hopeful for the first time in a long while. The fact that he was even having this conversation meant that there was a possibility, no matter how slim, that they could stop the war. They could save lives, prevent even more destruction. The ship entered Earth's atmosphere, and Mark prepared himself for what was to come. Virana stood beside him, her presence a constant reminder that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about both of them, about their people, about the future. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice calm. Mark took one last look out the window at the planet below. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing. They couldn't go back. There was no going back to war. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady. "Let's make this happen." Virana nodded. For peace. And with that, they descended into the unknown, ready to face whatever challenges awaited them. Mark stood at the foot of the ramp, leading off Virana's ship, his heart racing. This was it. They had arrived back on Earth. The familiar blue and green planet below him seemed so distant now, as if it no longer belonged to him. He had changed. The war, the aliens, and everything he had learned since meeting Virana had reshaped him. But now he was stepping back into a world that hadn't changed. A world that was still trapped in fear and distrust. Virana stood beside him, her eyes scanning the surroundings. Her ship had landed in a secure, undisclosed location, far from the public eye. But even here, on Earth's soil, the threat of conflict hung in the air. Mark could feel it. The tension of the moment. He turned to her. "We don't know how they'll react," he said quietly, his voice a mixture of nerves and determination. "But we have to try. For peace." Virana gave him a calm look. "No matter how they react, we will stay true to our mission," she said in her steady, confident tone. "We must give them the chance to hear us." Mark nodded, though doubt still clung to him. The thought of facing Earth's leaders, the ones who had fought so hard against the alien forces, was terrifying. He knew the risks. He knew that their message might be ignored, or worse, met with hostility. But what else could they do? If they didn't try, the war would never end. Humanity would continue fighting, and more lives would be lost on both sides. As they approached the meeting area, Mark's mind was racing. His thoughts were a jumble of worries. Would they listen? Would they understand? Was peace really possible? Or was he chasing a dream that could never come true? The doors to the secure facility opened, and the first few figures stepped out. Mark recognized them immediately. Human military officials, faces he had seen in many battle reports, people who had been part of the very conflict that had changed his life. Their expressions were hard, their eyes cold with years of distrust. He could see the skepticism in their eyes as they took in Virana, a towering alien figure standing beside him. "Captain Reynolds," one of the men said gruffly, "I see you've brought an alien with you. What's this about?" Mark met his gaze, his voice steady. "This is Captain Virana. She's here because we need to talk. Not just for the humans, but for everyone. The war needs to stop." The room fell silent. The humans looked from Mark to Virana, clearly uncertain about what to make of the situation. It wasn't just the alien presence that was unsettling. It was the message itself. The idea that peace was even possible seemed like a foolish dream to most of these hardened warriors. Another official, a woman with short black hair and sharp eyes, crossed her arms. "You've been gone for months, Captain. You come back with this alien and expect us to listen to some fairy tale about peace." Virana stepped forward, her voice calm but powerful. "It is not a fairy tale," she said, her eyes locking with the woman's. "It is the only way forward. Your people and mine have fought for too long. Too many lives have been lost. We have seen the devastation on both sides. If we do not change course, we will all be destroyed." The officials exchanged looks, clearly uncomfortable with the alien's words. The woman who had spoken first was the first to break the silence. "Are you saying we should just lay down our weapons and trust you?" she demanded. "How do we know this isn't another trap? How do we know you're not just waiting for a chance to destroy us?" Mark stepped in before Virana could respond. "I understand your doubts. I have them too. But I've seen what she can do. I've seen the sacrifices she's made for peace. We have to give this a chance." The room grew even more tense. It was clear that Mark's words were not enough to sway everyone. Some of the officials were still not convinced, but there were others, standing at the back of the group, who looked more thoughtful, more willing to listen. Another man, tall and older, with graying hair, spoke up. "Captain Reynolds, you're a soldier. You fought in this war. Why should we believe you now?" Mark took a deep breath. "Because I've seen the other side. I've seen what it's like to fight for survival, to lose everything, only to realize it's all for nothing. I've seen the aliens as enemies, but I've also seen them as people. People who want peace, just like we do." Virana nodded, her eyes softening as she looked at Mark. "We have all lost, but we can choose to stop losing. We can choose peace, but only if we are willing to take the first step." The silence that followed was heavy. Mark knew that this was the most difficult part. Convincing these leaders that peace was possible would not happen overnight. It would take time. It would take patience. It would take trust. Finally, the older man spoke again. "We'll give you one chance, Captain," he said. "One chance to prove that this is real. If you fail, we will not hesitate to act." Mark nodded. He knew what that meant. It was a warning. If they failed, there would be no more talks. The war would continue, and there would be no turning back. Virana stepped forward. "We will not fail. We will prove to you that peace is the only way." Mark felt a weight lift from his chest. They had made it this far. The first step had been taken. Now they had to make sure it wasn't the last. Mark stood before the room of Earth's military leaders, feeling the weight of the moment press down on him. He had returned with Captain Virana to offer them the chance of peace, but the doubts were still evident in the eyes of the people in this room. The alien captain had told them her people were ready to negotiate, But the humans had been fighting for years. The scars of war ran deep, and trust was hard to come by. Verena stood beside him, her presence commanding yet calm. She had been the one to risk everything, not just for her people, but for humanity as well. Mark knew she was doing all this with no guarantee of success, yet she stood firm, as resolute as the moment she had saved his life on her ship. The room was silent. The leaders were staring at them, each one deep in thought. Some still looked skeptical, some angry, and others unsure. The older man who had given them a chance to speak earlier cleared his throat, finally breaking the silence. "We've listened to your words, Captain Reynolds, Captain Verena," he said, his voice slow and careful. "But words aren't enough. We need action. We need proof that this peace is more than just an idea." Mark looked over at Verena, her expression steady. She had made it clear that the only way forward was through trust. But this was the test, the first step. "We understand," Mark replied, his voice calm but firm. "We didn't come here just to speak. We came to show you that peace is not just a dream, but something that can be achieved." Verena stepped forward. "My people are ready to prove it. We will work together with you to show that we can share our resources, our technology, and our knowledge. But the most important step is what we do next. We need to start somewhere. One gesture to show that we're willing to change the course of this war." The military leaders exchanged looks, and Mark could feel the tension in the air. The room seemed to shrink around him as they waited for a response. Finally, the woman with the short black hair spoke. "And what exactly is this gesture?" she asked, her tone sharp. Verena glanced at Mark and then turned back to the room. "We can start with something small but significant. A ceasefire. A moment of silence from both sides. No more attacks. No more fighting. We offer this in the name of peace, and we ask that you do the same." The older man narrowed his eyes, clearly considering her words. "A ceasefire," he repeated, as if testing the idea. "And what will happen if we agree to this? How do we know it will lead to anything?" "It's a beginning," Mark said, stepping in before Verena could respond. "A chance to build trust, to show we can stop the violence, even if it's just for a short time. It will allow us to talk, to negotiate without the fear of more lives being lost." There was a long pause. Mark could see the gears turning in the leaders' minds. They weren't making a decision yet, but at least they were thinking. The woman with the black hair spoke again, this time with a tone less hostile, though still cautious. "And if we agree to this ceasefire, what will you do?" she asked. "What is your plan to ensure this peace doesn't just fall apart?" Verena's eyes gleamed with determination. "We will honor it, just as you must. If both sides agree to stop fighting, we will not attack. We will stay true to our word. But it cannot be one-sided. If either side breaks the ceasefire, then the chance for peace is lost." Mark nodded. "This is the first step. We know it won't be easy. Trust takes time, but it's worth trying. We've already seen the horrors of war. If we don't try now, we'll be giving up on everything we've worked for." The room fell quiet once more as the leaders took in what had been said. Some of them seemed to consider it seriously, while others still held on to their skepticism. Mark's heart raced in his chest. This was a pivotal moment. He and Verena had taken the risk, and now it was in the hands of Earth's leaders. Finally, the older man spoke again. "We will agree to this ceasefire, but know this, Captain Reynolds, if this peace is broken, there will be no second chance, and if your people fail us, the consequences will be dire." Mark's breath caught. The conditions had been set, but it was more than he had hoped for. A ceasefire. A chance to prove that peace could work. He glanced at Verena, who gave him a small nod, as if to say, "This is the beginning." "Thank you," Mark said, his voice filled with relief and hope. "We won't fail you." Verena spoke as well, her voice calm and unwavering. "We will make this work. Together, we can bring peace." The leaders of Earth exchanged a few more words, and Mark and Verena were dismissed. As they walked out of the room, Mark felt a mix of exhaustion and hope. This was far from over, but it was a start. As they stepped into the cool air outside, Mark looked at Verena and smiled. "We did it," he said quietly. She nodded. "It's only the beginning, Captain, but it's a step in the right direction." Mark looked at her, the alien captain who had saved his life. In that moment, he knew their destinies were linked forever, bound by the hope of a future without war. The days following the agreement were filled with both anticipation and uncertainty. The ceasefire, fragile as it was, had been put into effect. On both sides, soldiers stood down, and the noise of battle had fallen silent. Yet Mark knew that the hardest part was still ahead, keeping the peace and proving that trust could be rebuilt after years of bloodshed. He sat in a quiet room, his mind racing. The leaders of Earth had agreed to the ceasefire, but for how long would it last? How would the other soldiers and commanders feel? Would they truly put down their weapons, or would there be another fight just waiting to happen? Verena entered the room, her tall form moving with quiet grace. She looked every bit the leader she was, her expression calm but serious. There was a hint of something more in her eyes, a recognition that this moment was the beginning of something monumental, not just for humanity, but for her people as well. "You're thinking about the future," she said, sitting across from him. "It's understandable, but we've done something that many thought impossible. We've taken the first step." Mark nodded, but the weight of his thoughts didn't leave him. "I know, but the peace we've started has to hold. It can't fall apart." Verena's eyes softened as she looked at him. "Nothing good is ever easy, but I believe in this. I believe in the strength of both our peoples to move forward. If we can make this work, if we can stay true to our word, then we can change the course of history." Mark took a deep breath and ran a hand through his hair. He thought back to the days of war, the lives lost, the hatred that had grown between their worlds. It seemed impossible that they could ever find common ground. Yet here they were, on the cusp of something that could end the fighting. "I'm just not sure how to keep everyone from falling back into old habits," he admitted. "There are still people out there who want to keep fighting. How do we stop that?" Verena leaned forward, her eyes locked onto his. "We lead by example. We show them what it means to trust, to build something better. Not just with words, but with actions. We will be the change we want to see. If we give them hope, then they will follow." Mark looked at her, and for the first time since the ceasefire, he felt a surge of confidence. Verena's belief in peace wasn't just something she spoke about, it was something she embodied. And maybe, just maybe, he could do the same. A message came through on the screen in front of them, interrupting his thoughts. It was from Earth's leaders, and it contained a new proposal. The ceasefire had been successful so far, but they wanted to take the next step. They wanted to meet with the leaders of the alien forces to discuss the future of the alliance. Mark's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the next step in what could be the most important moment of both human and alien history. He looked at Verena, who was already standing and preparing for the meeting. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice steady. He stood up, his nerves settling as he nodded. "I am. Let's do this." The meeting was held in a large hall, filled with representatives from both Earth and the alien factions. The air was thick with anticipation. Mark and Verena stood together at the front, their partnership symbolizing the fragile yet powerful alliance that had formed between their people. Earth's leaders were there, their faces serious but hopeful. Across from them stood the leaders of the alien forces, an intimidating sight, with warriors and diplomats alike, all watching closely. The older man, the one who had first agreed to the ceasefire, stepped forward. His eyes scanned the room before locking onto Mark and Verena. "We are here today," he began, "to take the next step. The ceasefire is held, and now we must ensure that peace isn't just a moment, but a lasting future. We must discuss the terms of an alliance that can benefit both our peoples." Mark felt the weight of the moment. This was the chance to prove that humanity could adapt, that it could build bridges instead of walls. And Verena was standing by his side, proving that the aliens, too, were willing to take the risk. "We are ready," Verena said, her voice clear and strong. "This is not just about peace. It is about creating something that will last. We are ready to share what we have learned and work together to build a future where we both can thrive." One of the alien leaders, a tall woman with silver scales shimmering along her arms, spoke next. "We are willing to share our knowledge of advanced technology, medicine, and resources, but only if trust can be maintained." Mark nodded, taking a deep breath. This was the challenge, wasn't it? Trust was the foundation of this entire endeavor. If they couldn't build it, then everything else would fall apart. "We understand," he said, "and we are ready to do our part. We've seen the cost of war. Now we want to see what we can build together." The leaders continued to speak, outlining the steps they would take to establish lasting peace. The tension that had filled the room slowly began to ease, replaced by something more hopeful, something more powerful than either side had ever imagined before. As the meeting came to an end, Mark stood with Verena, their hands briefly touching in a gesture of solidarity. They had done it. They had taken the first steps towards something that could change the universe. "We did it," Mark whispered, his voice filled with relief. Verena looked at him, her expression filled with something more than just victory. "No, Captain," she said, "this is just the beginning." And as they walked out of the room together, side by side, Mark knew she was right. This wasn't the end of their journey. It was only the first step in a new chapter of peace. They had saved each other's lives, and now together, they were saving their worlds.